This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to answer the question, will full blocks destroy Bitcoin? This is a question I got a couple of weeks ago. Hi Matt, could you do a video on what might happen as the Bitcoin blockchain grows? I know that you've covered this already in other videos, but if you project 4 megabyte blocks, 4 megabytes per block every 10 minutes, at what point in the future does it become insurmountable for regular people to run a node? Do you think computer storage technology evolution can keep up with the growing size of the blockchain such that even 10 years from now, regular people can still run full nodes? This is a really good question. I hope you excuse my presentation today. I'm dealing with an internet outage, and as such, everything's just going to be on one page here. It's not going to be pretty, but we're going to talk about it. So we first have to discuss the Bitcoin block size limit. Very early on in Bitcoin, in 2009, for example, there was no block size limit. In other words, a limit on the size that each block in the blockchain could be. In 2010, Satoshi quietly added a block size limit of 1 megabyte per block. No one knows exactly why he did this, but perhaps he was worried about spam attacks on the blockchain, which would bloat the blockchain size and hinder adoption and the ability to run a full node, as we're going to talk about. And then in 2017, we had the SegWit soft fork, which effectively increased block size to 4 megabytes as the maximum block size. So what's the whole debate about? Well, what happens if blocks are quote unquote too small? And it's a little bit arbitrary how we define these things, but if blocks are too small, it means you can't fit that many transactions into each block. Each block obviously comes every 10 minutes on average. There's a difficulty adjustment every 2 weeks approximately to make sure blocks keep coming in every 10 minutes on average. If blocks are too small, you can't fit that many transactions in each block, and that means that transactions per second, TPS, remains low. Now, on the other side of the debate, what happens if blocks are too big? Well, the bigger the blocks are, the more expensive it gets to run a Bitcoin node. Blocks come every 10 minutes, as we said, on average. If blocks are bigger, that means the size of the blockchain will grow more quickly. If the blockchain gets too big, it becomes too expensive for the average person to run a Bitcoin node. And there are various costs included with running a Bitcoin node. You have the storage costs. You need to store the blockchain, usually on an SSD these days. Bandwidth costs. You need to download not only new blocks as they get mined or generated, but initially you need to download the entire Bitcoin blockchain when you first set up a node. And this is so that your node can verify every transaction in every block to make sure that they conform to the rules going all the way back to 2009. And this is where the CPU comes in, where verification costs come in. The CPU on your node needs to verify every transaction and block from 2009 to the present, as we said. Now, if the blockchain gets too big, it becomes too expensive for the average person to do all of these things to run a Bitcoin full node. And this obviously hurts decentralization because fewer people will then run full nodes, or only people in very wealthy countries will be able to run it. For example, Ethereum now, it's extremely difficult technically and expensive to run a full node. And so everyone outsources their nodes to companies like Infure. So here's another problem with bigger blocks. If blocks are too large, a transaction fee market will not develop. And this is a little bit non-intuitive at first. In order to discuss this, we have to talk about how Bitcoin miners get paid. So they still get paid 6.25 new Bitcoin per block. This is called the block subsidy. Plus they also get all the transaction fees for every transaction that they have included in a block. And they're incentivized to always include the highest paying transactions in every block. And the market for block space, transaction fees, is this free market that adjusts to demand and supply. Now, every 4 years, as you all know, in other words, every 210,000 blocks, which come every 10 minutes, that translates to approximately every 4 years, this block subsidy of 6.25 gets cut in half. So it started off at 50, then it got cut to 25, then 12.5, and then at the 2020 halving, it got cut to 6.25 Bitcoin. In the next era, after 2024 to 2028, it's going to be only 3.125 Bitcoin, and then it'll get halved again in 2028. And Bitcoin miners will only be paid about 1.5 Bitcoin per block. Now, as the block subsidy falls, as these numbers fall with each halving, Bitcoin miners will need to rely more and more on transaction fees for their revenues. If blocks have a block size limit, instead, then people will compete with each other to get their transactions included in the next block. And you can think in terms of scarcity, for example, real estate scarcity, which is sort of a good analogy to block space scarcity. You think of a city like Los Angeles, which has a fairly limited area, and you have limited building space. You can go vertical, but you can't really go horizontal because you run up against the ocean and you run up against mountains, versus the virtually unlimited building space that you find in the Nevada desert. When you have this sort of scarcity, prices are higher as people compete to build their houses or include their transactions in a block. And this competition, as we said, helps to drive up transaction fees, which Bitcoin miners will increasingly rely on as the block subsidy continues to fall every 4 years. Now, when blocks are not full, people doing transactions can bid the bare minimum, which is 1 sat per VByte. I'm not going to go into what a VByte is, but this is basically the smallest amount you can pay for a transaction. And when blocks are not full, you can often get into the next block just bidding the minimum amount. Now, when blocks are full, the transaction fees always rise above 1 sat per VByte. The intention with Bitcoin always was, and this is very important, even before ordinals and inscriptions, the intention with Bitcoin always was to have full blocks. And since SegWit, since 2017, we've known that Bitcoin max block size, the size of an individual block, can reach as high as 4 megabytes. And this includes transaction data. It includes witness data as well, which I'll talk about in another video if you guys are interested. But for these purposes, it's important to just recognize that the max block size can reach 4 megabytes. So 4 megabyte blocks coming every 10 minutes, that means if you do the math and you multiply by how many minutes in an hour and how many hours in a day, etc., that adds approximately 210 gigabytes of stuff added to the blockchain every single year. So the question then, which the questioner was asking, can Bitcoin handle this? And the answer is, of course, definitely Bitcoin can handle this. The current size of the Bitcoin blockchain is 521 gigs. And if we have full blocks, if we have 4 megabyte blocks, the size of the blockchain will increase linearly by about 210 gigabytes per year. Now, what about the cost of storing the blockchain on an SSD, for example, when you're running a full node? Fortunately, thanks to things like Moore's Law, storage costs decrease exponentially. So, for example, I went back and looked it up. I looked up the price of an SSD, a 1 terabyte SSD back in 2018 on Amazon. It was approximately $230. Today, you can get the same SSD for approximately $60 to $90, depending on the type. So the size of the blockchain is growing linearly, even with 4 megabyte blocks. The cost of storage is falling exponentially, as we're seeing. It's fallen quite a bit since 2018, and we would expect this to continue because SSDs do benefit from Moore's Law, and there's still a lot of room to go there. In a few years, I suggest that a 2 terabyte SSD drive will cost you probably $5, $10, $15, somewhere around there. And so even if the Bitcoin blockchain is going up by 210 gigs per year, there's going to be plenty of room and people will be able to afford these storage costs. Eventually, you'll be able to get a multiple terabyte SSD for probably just a few cents, 25 cents, 50 cents, something like that. So it's important to remember in the context of this debate that full blocks are a good thing for Bitcoin security, and they'll become increasingly important as the block subsidy continues to fall with each halving. Now, I'd say it's a separate question if you're not happy about these blocks being filled with inscriptions and ordinals. Inscriptions, for those who don't know, are essentially NFTs that are actually on the Bitcoin blockchain itself. If you're not happy with these things, though, there's actually nothing you can do about it, in my opinion, unless you want to turn Bitcoin into a permissioned system. And if you want to turn Bitcoin into a permissioned system, who are you going to elect to decide what is a good use, a quote-unquote good use of block space, and what is a quote-unquote bad use of block space? And this is the point that Andrew Polster was making. If I had a good internet connection today, I could show you the quote. But basically, I shared this in a previous video, and he said, if you tell people that they cannot embed whatever you define as useless data, quote-unquote useless data, and I'm not a huge fan of NFTs, though I do recognize that a lot of people are interested in them. I consider NFTs and inscriptions to be basically useless data. You could inscribe some interesting things on the Bitcoin blockchain. You could put a portion of the Bible or the Quran or the US Constitution, or you could put, for example, recipes, how to make dangerous things that people don't want you to be able to make, for example. That might not be completely useless, but that will depend on person to person. But if you tell people that they cannot embed useless data on the blockchain, what's going to happen is people will figure out a way to embed their useless data inside, quote unquote, useless data, inside of whatever you have defined to be useful data. And this comes from one of the Bitcoin core devs, Andrew Polstra, whose opinion I respect quite a bit. If you, there's a tweet that I was meaning to cite where Casey Rodarmore, who was the guy who invented inscriptions and ordinals, basically said that he could have done the same thing if he had wanted on Satoshi's original software, so on the original version of Bitcoin. And so this is not just a problem that was caused by SegWit and Taproot. This is the fundamental question of having an open permissionless system, and people can embed various things. They could put it in the op return, they could put it in the witness data. There are various ways of sticking things on the blockchain, and we have examples of various things being put on the blockchain well before inscriptions and ordinals. And so you can't really police this unless you want to turn Bitcoin into a walled garden, and that would defeat the whole purpose of having Bitcoin. Am I worried that ordinals and inscriptions will eventually crowd out the purely financial, monetary uses of the Bitcoin blockchain? I'm not worried at all. The final settlement of a bearer asset is the most important market out there when you think of gold and US Treasuries and how large central banks settle transactions. And if you are going to settle an important financial transaction, you're going to want to do it on the Bitcoin base layer. And so there's always going to be demand for Bitcoin as money. Are you actually worried that this market for the final settlement of a bearer asset will not be able to compete with monkey JPEGs? This is not something that I'm worried about. I think this is a temporary fad. And I think even if it's not, these inscriptions will be priced out of the Bitcoin block space at some point. And I would caution people who want to decide for everyone what you can put on the Bitcoin blockchain and what you can't. History is full of central planners who want to micromanage rather than allowing a free market to work. That being said, here's what's completely non-negotiable to me. And I think these are the things we should be really fighting about, not fighting about inscriptions. Here's what's non-negotiable. Maximum supply of Bitcoin of 21 million must never, ever be increased. It's not going to need to be increased. The transaction fees will make up the difference. And there's a lot of FUD around this. I plan on making more videos about this topic. But this is non-negotiable. You cannot increase 21 million, or you've basically destroyed the most important thing about Bitcoin. Number two, the block size of 4 megabytes must never be changed going forward. It should not be increased. It should not be decreased. Maybe this block size is not perfect, but I think it's good enough. Maybe maximum supply of 21 million Bitcoin is not perfect, but it is still good enough. And I would say that these things are ultimately fairly arbitrary, and there's a wide range of numbers which would work. If Satoshi had launched Bitcoin with 23 million or 25 million max supply and 6 megabyte blocks, whatever it was, it would have been fairly good. But the most important thing is you don't mess with these things once they have been created and they're generally accepted. So you don't want to mess with Bitcoin's issuance schedule or its monetary policy. Let's leave it fixed in stone for the next 1,000 years, and then our descendants can take it from there. We don't want to end up like Ethereum and keep changing fundamental things like monetary policy, how miners get paid, whether transaction fees are getting burned, etc., or even the consensus mechanism, Ethereum moving from proof of work to proof of stake. These are huge, huge taboo changes that if you want to be the base monetary layer of the world, you should not be messing with. The ordinals inscriptions thing, though, I'm much less worried about. And as we can see from this video, even if we get block sizes of 4 megabytes from here to eternity, our storage costs, SSD cards, will definitely be able to keep up with that. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.